In the heart of New York City, there was a time when crime wasn't hidden. It ruled. Streets echoed with whispers of loyalty, power, and blood. 5 powerful families, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo, controlled everything from the docks to the police stations. They weren't gangsters, they were kings. Each ran their empire with a code of silence, omerta, where one mistake meant death and one secret could destroy everything. Money flowed like rivers, fear ruled like law, and betrayal lurked behind every handshake. Politicians bowed, businesses paid tribute, and ordinary citizens lived under their invisible rule. This was the golden age of the American Mafia, an era when the 5 families weren't just criminals. They were architects of an underground kingdom built on crime, respect, and revenge. But empires built on blood don't last forever. As greed grew, alliances cracked, and the law began to close in, the kings of New York would soon realize every throne in the underworld comes with a bullet waiting at the end. New York in the mid-20th century wasn't just a city. It was an empire divided among 5 powerful families. The skyline shimmered with wealth, but in the shadows, another world ruled. A world where crime was business, loyalty was law, and fear was currency. This was the golden age of the American Mafia. It began with men who rose from poverty and prejudice, immigrants who built an empire from the alleys of Little Italy. They started with gambling, bootlegging, and protection rackets, but soon their reach spread everywhere. The docks, construction companies, unions, even Hollywood. At the top of this criminal hierarchy stood the 5 families: Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo, each led by a boss who wielded absolute power. Together, they formed the Commission, a council designed by Lucky Luciano to keep peace and divide territory. For decades, it worked. The mafia became untouchable, richer than corporations, stronger than the police, and feared by politicians. Their influence stretched from city streets to the White House corridors. But as their power grew, so did their enemies. Jealousy, betrayal, and ambition began to fracture the foundation. The same code that built their empire would soon tear it apart. This is the true story of how the American Mafia ruled New York, like kings who thought their empire would never fall. The story of the American Mafia's golden age begins long before the skyscrapers and limousines, back in the early 1900s, when thousands of Italian immigrants arrived in America chasing the dream of freedom and fortune. But for many, that dream was a lie. They faced discrimination, poverty, and violence. Out of these hard streets rose a new kind of order, one built not by politicians or police, but by men who believed in power, silence, and respect. They called it La Cosa Nostra, our thing. In the back alleys of New York, small Italian gangs began to form, controlling neighborhoods and protecting their people. They ran gambling dens, loan shark operations, and small rackets. During Prohibition in the 1920s, everything changed. Alcohol became illegal, and overnight, crime became one of America's most profitable businesses. Bootleggers made millions smuggling whiskey and rum, and soon the gangs began to expand into full-blown organizations. Among them rose a young man who would change everything: Charles Lucky Luciano. Unlike the older gangsters, who ruled with emotion and tradition, Luciano had vision. He believed crime could be run like a corporation, structured, disciplined, and united. He saw the chaos of constant wars between Italian, Irish, and Jewish gangs as bad for business. So, he set out to end it. Luciano joined forces with men like Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese, creating an alliance that crossed ethnic lines. Together, they orchestrated the downfall of the old bosses who refused to modernize. The bloody Castellamarese War, which had torn the mafia apart, ended when Luciano betrayed and eliminated the old Don, Salvatore Maranzano. From that moment, a new era began. Luciano reorganized the mafia into 5 families, each with its own boss, underboss, and soldiers. At the top sat the commission, a board of directors made up of all the family bosses, designed to keep peace and resolve disputes. It was revolutionary. For the first time, crime had a government of its own. Each family had its territory and operations. The Genovese family, known for their cunning and power, focused on labor, racketeering, and construction. The Gambino family, elegant and disciplined, handled ports, trucking, and unions. The Lucchese family specialized in garment rackets, while the Bonanno and Colombo families managed gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics. Together, they ruled every corner of New York City, every street, every deal, every dollar. With prohibition profits rolling in, the mafia became unstoppable. They built connections with judges, police captains, and politicians. They controlled who got elected, which businesses thrived, and who disappeared. Their code of omerta, the oath of silence, kept outsiders guessing. Anyone who broke it met a brutal fate. To ordinary New Yorkers, they were both feared and admired. They threw lavish parties, donated to churches, and played the role of protectors in poor neighborhoods. But behind the charm was blood, ruthless discipline that punished betrayal without hesitation. By the 1940s, Lucky Luciano's structure had transformed crime forever. What began as street gangs had evolved into an empire of power and profit. The mafia had become a shadow government, as strong as the one in City Hall. And under this new order, the 5 families didn't just survive, they thrived. The streets of New York now belonged to the mafia. Every dollar that moved, every shipment that arrived, every deal that was made, some part of it went to them. They were untouchable. They were invisible. And as the golden age of the American Mafia dawned, a dark truth emerged. These men weren't just criminals. They were kings in tailored suits, building a dynasty that no one dared to challenge. The 1950s and 1960s marked the peak of mafia dominance in America, an era when the 5 families transformed from street gangs into a billion-dollar criminal empire. They controlled the ports, construction unions, gambling rings, nightclubs, and even certain government contracts. To the public, the mafia was invisible. To those inside the system, it was everywhere. And at the center of this vast empire sat the Godfathers, men who commanded absolute power with a single nod or phone call. Carlo Gambino, the quiet Don, was perhaps the most respected of them all. He preferred diplomacy over violence, but when violence was necessary, it was executed with surgical precision. His business sense turned the Gambino family into the wealthiest of the 5, managing labor unions, shipping companies, and high-stakes rackets that stretched from Brooklyn to Miami. Gambino operated like a corporate CEO. He didn't just commit crimes, he managed them like a business portfolio. Then there was Vito Genovese, a man as ruthless as he was ambitious. He didn't believe in alliances or peace. Genovese wanted complete control, and he didn't care how many bodies it took to get there. When Lucky Luciano was deported, Genovese saw his chance to seize the throne. He waged silent wars within the commission, planting spies, eliminating rivals, and even attempting to poison Gambino's influence. Meanwhile, Joseph Bonanno dreamed of turning the mafia into a dynasty. To him, the 5 families should function like royalty. His sons would inherit power. His name would last forever. But Bonanno's ambition would soon set off a chain reaction that nearly destroyed everything. During this golden age, the mafia operated with frightening efficiency. Trucking companies paid for protection. Construction projects couldn't begin without approval. And a cut. Restaurants, nightclubs, casinos, and even banks were quietly owned or controlled by the families. Politicians took donations in exchange for favors. Union leaders bowed to the Godfathers like kings before a throne. What made this era extraordinary wasn't just the money, it was the illusion of respect. Many mobsters dressed like businessmen, attended church on Sundays, and lived in quiet neighborhoods. To outsiders, they looked like successful entrepreneurs. Inside, however, they ruled through intimidation, loyalty, and blood. Even Hollywood couldn't resist the allure of this secret empire. Films like The Godfather drew direct inspiration from the real mafia world. Some actors even met with mobsters to study their mannerisms. Ironically, real gangsters loved those movies. They saw them as tributes to their code of honor, even as the FBI saw them as confessions. Behind closed doors, though, the unity was starting to crack. Genovese's thirst for dominance created rivalries. Bonanno's secret plans to control the commission led to paranoia. Gambino, ever the strategist, maintained peace by manipulating both sides. But even he knew the balance couldn't last. And while the families plotted against one another, the world outside was changing. Law enforcement was growing smarter, the FBI was learning new surveillance tactics, and public patience was running thin. Politicians, once silent partners, began to fear exposure. Still, in the heart of New York, the mafia's rule felt unshakable. To challenge them was suicide. To cross them was a death sentence. The city pulsed under their invisible rule, its heartbeat measured not by clocks, but by cash and contracts. For a while, it seemed the five families were invincible. They had wealth, power, and the kind of influence that even presidents couldn't ignore. But history has a cruel rule. Empires that rise too high eventually begin to fall. And for the American Mafia, that fall began the moment the first shot of betrayal echoed through the streets of New York. By the mid-1960s, the cracks in the Mafia's empire had begun to show. What started as quiet whispers of ambition soon turned into open warfare. The five families, once united under the Commission's rules, were now consumed by greed, jealousy, and revenge. The code of omerta, the sacred vow of silence, was breaking. Men who once called each other brother were now plotting assassinations behind closed doors. The golden age of power was turning into an age of blood. It all began with Joseph Bonanno, the man who dreamed of creating a mafia dynasty. Bonanno believed that his family deserved to rule over all the others. Secretly, he tried to organize a coup, an attempt to eliminate rival bosses and take over the commission. When word leaked out, chaos exploded. The other families declared war. For months, bodies piled up in Brooklyn and Queens. Car bombs, drive-by shootings, and disappearances became routine. The streets that once symbolized order under mafia control now echoed with the sounds of betrayal. This brutal period became known as the Bonanno War. It was a turning point in mafia history. Friends turned into enemies, soldiers switched sides for money, and the FBI began noticing the carnage. What had once been a secret empire was now bleeding in public. The Colombo family faced its own civil war soon after. Internal factions led by Joe Colombo, Joseph Magliocco, and Crazy Joe Gallo turned the family into a battlefield. The Gallo brothers, unpredictable and violent, challenged traditional leadership, launching brazen attacks that shocked the mafia world. One hit would be answered by three more. Even family dinners became dangerous meetings filled with paranoia and loaded guns. The mafia's internal wars didn't just destroy peace. They destroyed profits. Businesses were neglected, rackets were disrupted, and cops began circling like vultures. The FBI saw their chance. Every bomb, every body, every feud gave the authorities more reasons to dig deeper. In the midst of the chaos, Carlo Gambino tried to restore order. Unlike the others, Gambino was patient. He didn't believe in open warfare. He believed in quiet control. Using diplomacy and money, he positioned himself as the new boss of bosses. Under his leadership, the mafia managed to stabilize temporarily, but the damage had been done. The old sense of unity, the idea that the five families were one, was gone forever. By the late 1970s, paranoia had become part of daily life. Wiretaps, informants, and hidden microphones turned every conversation into a risk. Mobsters started fearing each other more than the FBI. The era of trust had ended. Now, everyone was watching everyone. To the outside world, the Mafia still seemed untouchable. Their casinos thrived in Las Vegas, their money flowed through legitimate businesses, and their influence reached Washington. But inside, the walls were collapsing. Rivalries festered. Leaders plotted in secret. Soldiers questioned orders. The old ways, respect, honor, silence, were being replaced by greed, fear, and desperation. As more blood spilled on the streets, the FBI intensified its pursuit. They began mapping the structure of the five families, identifying bosses, underbosses, and captains. They knew that to destroy the Mafia, they had to attack its leadership, the commission itself. The once glorious golden age of the American Mafia was now soaked in its own blood. The Godfathers had built an empire of power and fear, but they had forgotten one thing. The bigger the empire, the more enemies it makes. And soon, those enemies would come knocking. The Mafia wars had begun, but the real war, the one between the Mafia and the United States government, was just about to start. By the late 1970s, the golden age of the American Mafia was fading fast. The blood-soaked wars had weakened the families from within, and now an even greater enemy was closing in, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What began as quiet surveillance soon became an all-out war between law enforcement and organized crime. For the first time in history, the five families faced an opponent they couldn't bribe, threaten, or silence. The Mafia had grown too bold. The violence, the public shootings, the flashy lifestyles. It was impossible to hide anymore. Newspapers began printing names of bosses like Carlo Gambino, Paul Castellano, and Vito Genovese. The public wanted justice, and the FBI was ready to deliver it. New laws, particularly the RICO Act, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, gave the government the power to dismantle criminal organizations from the top down. Instead of targeting low-level soldiers, prosecutors could now charge entire families, including the bosses who gave the orders. The FBI started planting bugs in social clubs, restaurants, and even homes. Conversations that once seemed private were now evidence. One of the most famous cases came from Operation Donnie Brasco, where FBI agent Joseph Pistone went undercover for 6 years inside the Bonanno family, posing as a jewel thief named Donnie Brasco. He recorded hundreds of conversations, exposed dozens of mobsters, and directly contributed to the downfall of the Bonannos. It was the most successful infiltration in Mafia history, and it terrified every other family. As more information surfaced, the FBI's strategy became clearer: destroy the commission. In 1985, federal prosecutor Rudy Giuliani launched the commission case, a massive trial that charged the bosses of the five families with racketeering, murder, and conspiracy. It was the biggest mafia case America had ever seen. Among those indicted were Paul Castellano of the Gambino family, Anthony Fat Tony Salerno of the Genovese family, Carmine Persico of the Colombos, and other top leaders. The trial was devastating. For decades, the Mafia had operated under a shield of fear and silence, but now the code of Omerta was breaking. Informants began flipping, choosing prison time or protection over loyalty. Courtrooms that once seemed untouchable now echoed with testimonies of betrayal. When the verdicts came down, the message was clear. The Mafia's reign of invincibility was over. And yet, even with many bosses behind bars, the streets didn't go silent. New leaders emerged. John Gotti, a brash and flamboyant figure from the Gambino family, rose to power after orchestrating the assassination of his own boss, Paul Castellano, outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. The hit shocked the world. It was bold, public, and brutally efficient. Gotti became a media sensation, earning the nickname the Dapper Don for his expensive suits and arrogant smile. But his fame came at a price. The FBI made him their #1 target. Through wiretaps and undercover operations, they slowly built a case against him. In 1992, after years of cat-and-mouse games, John Gotti was convicted of murder and racketeering. The man who once ruled New York's underworld was now serving life in prison without parole. By then, the FBI had achieved what once seemed impossible. They had torn apart the structure of the American Mafia. The commission was gone, most of the godfathers were imprisoned, and the old ways of organized crime had been shattered. But in the shadows, something else was happening. A quiet transformation. The Mafia wasn't dead. It was adapting. The next generation of mobsters would be smarter, quieter, and more businesslike. The age of the flashy dons was over, but the Mafia's story was far from finished. By the 1990s, the American Mafia stood at the edge of collapse. What had once been a golden empire of loyalty, wealth, and control was now falling apart, piece by piece. The commission had been dismantled, its legendary bosses imprisoned or dead. The FBI had done what seemed impossible. It brought down the untouchable kings of New York. But as the Golden Age ended, the story of the Mafia took on a new form. One built not on power and blood, but on survival and legacy. The downfall began with betrayal. Omerta, the sacred oath of silence, had been the backbone of the Mafia for decades. Breaking it was the ultimate sin, punishable by death. But the FBI's tactics, the long sentences, and the lure of witness protection began to change everything. One by one, powerful men started talking. High-ranking figures like Sammy the Bull Gravano, John Gotti's underboss, flipped and testified in court. Gravano's testimony alone sent Gotti, once the Teflon Don, to prison for life. His betrayal sent shockwaves through the underworld. If someone like Sammy could break Omerta, no one was safe anymore. With each trial and conviction, the old Mafia hierarchy crumbled. Vincent the Chin Gigante, who pretended to be insane for decades to avoid prosecution, was finally exposed. Carmine Persico of the Colombo family died behind bars. The Bonannos, once one of the most powerful families, became riddled with informants. The power structure that Lucky Luciano had built was gone. The Mafia that ruled New York like kings now existed only in whispers and memories. But the Mafia didn't vanish. It evolved. The new generation learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. They avoided the spotlight, stayed away from violence, and moved into legitimate businesses: construction, waste management, restaurants, even stock manipulation. They still made money, still held influence, but they operated like ghosts. The age of bloody wars and flashy godfathers was replaced by quiet, invisible control. Meanwhile, Hollywood and the media kept the legend alive. Movies like Goodfellas, Casino, and The Sopranos turned real-life mobsters into cultural icons. The same world the FBI fought to destroy became entertainment for millions. People were fascinated not just by the violence, but by the loyalty, the family code, the sense of order in chaos. The Mafia, once a symbol of fear, became part of America's mythology. Yet behind the glamour, the truth remained darker. Families were destroyed, lives were lost, and entire neighborhoods lived in the shadow of men who ruled with fear. The Mafia's golden age had been built on blood, and every dollar, every handshake, came with a cost. By the 2000s, the five families still existed, but they were no longer the kings of New York. They were ghosts of their former selves, weakened, cautious, and constantly watched. The FBI had cameras, informants, and digital surveillance everywhere. Gone were the smoky social clubs and whispered meetings. The empire of suits and silencers had become a story told in documentaries, books, and fading memories. And yet, the legend never truly died. Because the story of the American Mafia isn't just about crime. It's about power, ambition, and the rise and fall of men who wanted to rule a nation from the shadows. They built a kingdom without borders, a government without elections, and a loyalty stronger than law. This was the golden age of the American Mafia, a time when 5 families ruled New York like kings, and their story became one of the most unforgettable chapters in American history.